Hello, welcome to Postcolonial Space, and thank you so much for joining me today. And today's webinar is on literature pedagogy in general, because some of you had asked me for it. And I've already received quite a few questions, and the most important question I think that people have asked is, how is literature pedagogy any different from any other pedagogy? And I think that's really an interesting question to address. In my opinion, literature pedagogy is different because we don't just deliver content. We are bringing to our students more than just the words on a page, because what we are offering is creative works that invoke certain tropes, works that have a layered language, and usually also have a message. And then there is no single way of reading them. So what we are also bringing, to the so-called proverbial table is also texts that have the ability to invoke certain modes of thinking, texts that have the ability to move the readers. So in that sense, then we are dealing with literature, an object of study, which itself is pretty fluid. But it also has huge possibilities if we develop certain pedagogical techniques that don't just teach the text, but also encourage our students to think about the world in which they live in. So that's what I think partially what makes literature pedagogy different. There was another question that was sent to me. Was someone had asked me to compare my experience of teaching or learning literature in Pakistan and how is it comparatively different over here. And I mean, I do this comparison not with this idea that one is better than the other, but by and large, my experience of studying literature in Pakistan was because I was being taught in a colonial setting. So most of the times, our professors thought that their job was to give us the content and encourage us to master it, memorize it, and reproduce it. There was rarely a chance to sit down and talk about literature in an open-ended discussion, right? Because all the efforts, at least in the early school years, were meant towards grasping whatever was offered as an answer to certain questions and then reproducing it in an exam, right? And that comes from the colonial archive, colonial history of pretty much all British colonies, right? Because that was the mode of content, that was a curriculum that was followed, mode of instruction that was followed. Part of it is also from our native traditions. If you look at the Muslim or even the Hindu native traditions of learning, there is a very strong emphasis on surrendering your will to the teacher, surrendering your will to the guru, right? Because that is the beginning of learning. And then we let someone else take charge of our souls, take charge of who we are, and let them guide us. And there is not much room there of a debate, of a discussion. So maybe partially our native and colonial cultures combined have developed a sort of culture in which literature is also like any other content that is delivered and the students reproduce. So these are some of my thoughts about the questions that were sent to me. And so I have Rubab Baloch, please guide us for preparation for lecture. I don't know what you mean by it. I mean, if you mean to guide you about how to be a lecturer, how to be a professor, here is the thing. I mean, you can either be content deliverers or you can be scholars and teachers at the same time. What a content deliverer does is prepares slide, right, has notes, and basically stands in front of the class and says, today we will talk about Shakespeare's The Tempest. It has 5 acts, it has 7 characters, they say all these things. Here are 10 different meanings that you can construe from them, and take notes. And when I ask you a question, discuss The Tempest. These are the answers I want from you. That is easier because you have your notes, you can repeat them over time. It doesn't matter when the class comes in. Now, if you want to be a teacher who has an impact, then besides learning what you are going to teach, you read constantly, right? You read in your field of study. You develop and learn the vocabularies of your field of study. You understand them. You never just throw big words out there. When you throw them out, you ought to know, what are different connotations of them. So if you develop yourself as scholars who can speak off the cuff, who have basic knowledge of their field of study, and then have developed oral expression, right? It doesn't matter which language. It can be in Urdu, in Hindi, in Punjabi, in English, as long as you have facility with words, and that comes with practice, right? But you can't practice if you don't know anything, right? So develop the basic knowledge of your field of study or whatever you are going to teach, right? And then you can work on, the modes of delivery, how to speak. And the best method for that is practice, right? So you can start with notes. You can have your written chronology of what you're going to cover first, what are you going to cover next, right? But as long as you have the knowledge to back it up, right, then you can answer questions, you can handle them. And that's, in my opinion, is the best way. Similarly, how do you do that? I mean, I've addressed this in so many of my live conversations with people, but also in my lectures, is by constantly, incrementally keep learning about your field of study. I mean, if you look at my office, if I could show it to you, I am surrounded by books, right? Now, these are not just for decoration. These are most of the books in my office are the books that I've read. But then I'm constantly updating my list. I need to read this. I need to read this. So that's just about my area of specialization. But then I have also made an effort to learn about pedagogical philosophies, right? What are more effective? Who wrote what about pedagogy, so that as I practice teaching, as I go and teach in class, my practices are also informed by latest research, not just on what is the best delivery method, but about how students receive the knowledge that we share with them. All of these things then help you become a more effective teacher. Now, in humanities, it is crucial because in my opinion, humanistic education can help us encourage our students to become more aware of the world, to become critically aware of the world, to develop the habits of thinking beyond the system, thinking about whichever system they exist in critically. So these are some of the long-term measures that you can take to become an effective teacher, but an effective teacher of humanities, right? I'll come to the questions in a minute. Now, the worst thing that you can do in a humanities class is tell your students, this is the answer and you must reproduce it to do well. A student should be able to give you any answer in a written essay as long as they can prove it with references to the text and as long as their answer is plausible, because then you're encouraging them to think about the text and not just try to second guess you and try to see what is it that you want. That's what the British taught us. That's what our teachers in our villages taught us, to just try to reproduce what the teacher wanted. And that creates a very subservient identity and a self that cannot think for itself. So these are some of my thoughts. Let's go to the question. Let's go to Hina. You have a lot of knowledge about how to teach. What will be your suggestion to study educational management to be a good lecturer, even if I'm an English literature researcher? It doesn't matter. I mean, we don't make the distinction of researcher and teacher. We teach our classes and we do our research, right? I am at a Research One university, but that doesn't necessarily mean that I'm just a researcher. What it means is that I'm given the resources to publish research, but teaching is also my primary job. So the best is, if you are going to do humanistic education, and if you want a philosophical text, especially if you're teaching in the developing world, mostly to a demographic, that is struggling, right? I would start with Pedagogy of the Oppressed, right? Read Pedagogy of the Oppressed carefully. I still have it on my desk. Paulo Freire's Pedagogy of the Oppressed will give you an idea of not just what kind of a world we live in, but what kind of pedagogy is necessary to create the teacher who matters, but also to create students who are free, responsible, but also free. I have a whole series of lectures on the Pedagogy of the Oppressed. I would highly recommend that you should read it. And then there are different, just do simple research on pedagogy, and you will see, there are books that specifically deal with literature pedagogy, humanities pedagogy, but it will help you articulate, what do you mean when you say you're a lecturer? Does it mean that you teach the subjects? We say that in Pakistan, aapko ye subject padhane. Or do we still, working within the constraints, create a class atmosphere in which students learn more than just what is in a text and reproduce it, where we teach them how to think critically? And for that, you have to go and learn what are the most effective ways of doing that. Now, if you look at my channel, I have a whole series that is developing on Paulo Freire. Then I have quite a few lectures on Mark Brocker's work on radical pedagogy. All of these resources are just available on one channel, right? Which you can start with. And then if you're really serious about becoming a more humane and effective teacher who can have an impact, then stay on top of what is the new research in teaching in pedagogy. Where is it coming from? In Pakistan, India, elsewhere, you can ask your colleagues in the education department. Chances are, if they are not stuck in that prehistoric mode, maybe someone there is doing contemporary research on how to teach urban kids, how to teach rural kids, because one rule doesn't apply to everyone. Okay, so Bilal, sorry, they have not made that available to me in a recorded form. They said they would. If they do, and if they permit me, I'll post it here. But it was a really good session. Okay, Chandra. Cool. So is literature pedagogy same as literary theory pedagogy, or is there any fine difference? That's a really good question. Okay, now let me say that technically, from my point of view, we cannot really teach literature effectively if we don't know literary theory. Okay, and here is the reason for it. Because what the theory does is it teaches us different ways of thinking about literature, right? So let's say if I'm a new critic as a professor, then I'll walk into a class and say, we will not talk about anything outside the text. You will not talk about the author. You will not talk about your own feelings. You will not talk about the feelings of the poet. Here are the words on a page. Just tell me how the poet builds the tensions from one to another. What kind of ambiguities are there? Now, you will then be that kind of a teacher because you're a new critic, right? Now, similarly, if you're a feminist scholar, right, and I give you a novel written by a guy, right, In your classroom, then you will be pointing out, look, this is how this woman is being represented. This does this to the cause of women's rights, right? Now, the reason you're doing that as a pedagogue is because you're a feminist, and you can be a political feminist, right? Of course. But chances are, if you're a feminist, you've read on feminist theory, you've read other feminists' work. So, in a way, then, pedagogy has its own theory and it has its own research, right? I employ some of it in my lectures here, I employ some of it in my classes, right? But the idea is that if you know literary theory, then your view of how to approach literature will be mediated through that. Now, if you combine it with pedagogy theory and research, then what you're doing is you're using the research in pedagogy, filtering your literary theory prejudices or preferences through it, and then coming with a mode of delivery or mode of teaching which has both incorporated in it. Let me give you an example. Now, my colleague, former colleague and friend, Mark Bracker has a beautiful book called Radical Pedagogy. And there is a chapter in it in which he talks about how historicism can be destructive to students. Now, you, me, and everyone else have always been taught to always historicize when we teach. But what he is saying, why it can be destructive, is because, first of all, if people from the dominant group in your class will say, well, this happened 100 years ago, we are not responsible for it. People from the minority groups in your class will say, yeah, these are our historical grievances, and we are going to build an identity around it and not let anyone else in. So what, in Mark Bracker's words, then what it does is it causes identity constriction. Instead of opening up the identity, it allows you to either dismiss history as the past or create an identity which is just within that limited idea of your own cultural identity. In both these cases, then my handling of the text then is informed by my own theoretical background, but my understanding of how historicism impacts students, and that way I can deliver a more effective pedagogy. So yes, absolutely. The difference is that when you go to the theorists of pedagogy, they basically sometimes focus on assessment, sometimes focus on delivery, sometimes focus on what happens to students when we say certain things, when we do certain things. Whereas literary theory doesn't pretty much tell us how to teach, it tells us how to read text. But if you could combine the two, then you can be a more effective and influential and persuasive teacher. That is what I have experienced in my life. Thank you so much. And Chandra, also thank you so much for becoming a member of my channel. You were actually the first member of my channel. Thank you so much for your support. And I'm seeing that they are just showing this sign over there. There should be a fist next to your hand. I'll see how I can fix that. Okay, so Fayaz, any book consisted of for English literature, and it's, what do you mean by MCQs? I don't know the acronym. So if you could explain MCQs, I would be very grateful. This is a good question, Fayaz, again. How can we inculcate creative thinking? And that's a really, so think of it this way. What is creative thinking? The liberty one takes to imagine things creatively and differently, right? So the basic step in encouraging your students to think creatively is first to create an atmosphere where they know that if they come up with their own opinion about a question or about a text, they will not be shot down. So you first have to create an atmosphere where they don't feel threatened and where they feel that if they say something in class, even if they are wrong, they will not be derided, they will be respected, and they'll be politely maybe told, hey, this is another way. So you create an atmosphere, right? And then you create assignments that are creative. One of the assignments that I used to use as a graduate student, and that was not in a literature class, but that was in a writing class, is For the second paper, I will ask my students, imagine yourself to be someone else, right? And then write a paper from that point of view. Now, what I was then encouraging them was not to be creative only in their paper, but to be creative in what kind of identity do they inhabit. Right? One student actually wrote a paper as a hobbit, how he would experience the world as a hobbit. What problems would he have climbing the stairs? So the idea is that create an atmosphere which is not threatening, and which tells the students no matter what their identities, wherever they come from, they will be respected, their opinions will be heard, right? They will not be attacked either by you or by their peers. So you have to control, peer-to-peer pressuring, right? And then when they have that feeling, when they know that they are safe in your classroom, that they will be respected, and that they have the freedom to express themselves freely, right? Within the borders of civility, of course, the limits. We always tell our students what not to do. You can't like curse anyone and all that. Then they will walk into your class excited because they are not just there for your lectures and take it down notes. They're there because they can express themselves. And then your assignments can be assignments that encourage creativity, different ways of looking at a text, different ways of experiencing a text, different ways of developing different ways of teaching a text. You can even give them those kind of, wherever you involve their critical thinking and encourage it, then you will be developing their creative skills. Okay, Chandra, Ludwig was a key philosopher on language. What role he plays, if any, in the... I haven't read much of him. Eagleton uses him a little bit. But to be very honest, I have never really read Wittgenstein carefully. If you do, and if it is useful to you, absolutely fine. Like I've read Heidegger, Gadamer, and others because they are useful to me. Any philosopher that you, even of course Nietzsche, if you want to do like post-structuralism and all. The idea is no single philosopher is going to explain everything to you, but there are different strains in literary theory that come from different philosophical schools of thought. So whichever you use, the idea is then go and read them carefully and in detail, right? And then you will form your own opinions. Okay, so Fiaz, the candidates are preparing for lectureship. They are looking for a book consisting of MCQs. What I don't understand is what is MCQ regarding English literature and his... so MCQs, what I'm understanding is that these are some standardized tests, right? So these are also in Pakistan, right? And so my answer to these kind of things is always pragmatic, okay? And pragmatic in a sense that, look, if you need to take a test for a job, you take the test. Our students do that, SAT, our students have to take GRE or whatever. Then you do the test prep, okay? Because you have no room there to say, well, this could mean a third thing too, because the system doesn't understand subtlety. It doesn't understand nuance. Yeah, mostly it's objective questions, true and false. So if your entry into the noble profession of teaching is through a standardized test, which you, me, and everyone else thinks is a stupid test, do that. Don't make it an issue, right? Prepare for it, whatever other people, whatever they use to prepare for it. But once you are in, then you're within the system, right? Then don't replicate that test mechanism as far as possible. I know there are constraints that institutions would tell you, इसमें 40% objective question होने चाहिए और ये वो. I know India, Pakistan, ये सारा जो हमारा culture. But then within that, whatever freedom you have to make your delivery, your curriculum, your teaching more egalitarian, right? More responsive to students' needs, do that. because that's where your agency as a teacher will play a role. But as far as like preparing for standardized tests and everything else, I wish that people understood that if they do long-term deep learning, they will still be able to answer those questions. But most of the times, even our students over here, you know, when they have to take the GRE, they spend 3 months or take a course. And because part of it is also test taking skills, right? You have to learn the test taking skills, not just what is going to be in the test. So for that, pragmatically, go ahead, do that. Oh yeah, multiple choice questions. Okay. Um, and then when you are, I have never given to my students, you know, uh, unless we started teaching online last semester, and even then I did essay questions. One reason a lot of professors do multiple choice questions or true false questions is if they have a heavy teaching load, right? And they have to grade 100 papers every week, you don't have time to give essay questions, right? That's when you use something where all you have to do is true, false, false. You follow a key and grade them. But if you don't have a heavy teaching load, if you have just 40, 50 students, I would say that do short essay questions. There is another technique that my wife uses, and she has a heavy teaching load, but she assigns micro essays, right? She gives a topic, and the students have to write just a 2-paragraph essay. It's still an answer that requires them to think and write critically, but think and write very concisely. So what it does for her is it's easier for her to grade, right? But what it still encourages in the students is that they still have to sit down and come up with 2 paragraphs to answer a question. That could be another technique. Okay. I think, Fayaz, I answered your question. All right. Okay, how to be a persuasive teacher in teaching? I mean, these are some of the things to which, of course, there are no clear answers. This is what has worked for me. And this experience can be gendered, and it will be different at different places, right? You'll have to work with the body of students that you have. What has worked for me is that I'm always open, right? I give my policy to my students. Here is the syllabus. This is what we will follow. But then I also tell them that, look, during a semester, if you feel like there is an assignment that is curbing your curiosity, that is hindering your learning, one of you should stand up and propose a different assignment. And if majority of you vote on it, and if it doesn't seriously dumb down the assignment, I will change the assignment. And now that doesn't hurt me much, because all it takes for me is to reconfigure an assignment. But what it creates symbolically in the classroom is this feeling that the students feel that they have a say in their own learning, right? And that encourages them to be more invested in the class. Other than that, I would say be fair, right? And be respectful of your students, be polite, be nice, kind, generous, all those things that we want from people in life. The problem is that, and this is what my female colleagues have to face, students respond differently to male and female teachers. When I tell these things to my wife, she is like, yeah, you're a guy, you can get away with it. Half of the time, the female professors, they have to spend a lot of time in an effort to be taken seriously. So they can't walk into a class and say, hey, I'm your friend. They have to establish authority, because the way they are perceived by predominantly male students is different. So know those constraints, right? And then, of course, where you are. I mean, I can give you this example from my Pakistani experiences. A lot of my Pakistani friends have this stereotype that Americans are really spoiled and all that. And they ask me, how do I view my students? And I tell them, like, I've taught at 3 research universities, right? Each one of them had more than 40,000 students on their campus, right? My students on 3 campuses, I have never seen in America, right, a bunch of men standing under a tree, right, and doing something stupid as some female students passed by. I've never seen them made cat calls. I've never seen them whistle or even be disrespectful to women, right? This is my personal experience. In the classroom, our students are so respectful. They are not diffident, but they are respectful. They are polite to each other. They are polite to us, right? Very rarely would you encounter a student who's disruptive. We don't have this culture जैसे इंडिया पाकिस्तान में है ना कि यार टीचर को छेड़ना है. The joking is making fun of others. Our students don't have that kind of a culture. Now, I don't know if it's a good thing or a bad thing, but we have to keep that in mind as we interact with our students. If you have a bunch of students who are disrupting your class, you have to first establish your authority, especially as a female professor. That's what I have learned from my students, former students, and also from my wife. Okay, can you comment on orienting one's teaching from a global perspective? How does a global perspective of teach? Well, I usually don't make this distinction because I have a global field of study and I'm teaching in America, but I'm originally from Pakistan, so I kind of inhabit that identity. But I think, let's say, if you're teaching in India or Pakistan or elsewhere in the world, a global perspective would be where if you're teaching any piece of literature, right? So you bring to bear while teaching it, hey, this is how we read it here, okay, in India or in Pakistan. But here is how a Western critic has read it, right? So read this to find out how can you read a text without entering religion into it, without entering ethnic identity into it. And that way they will then learn not just to approach the text from their own local perspective, but also the ability to see how others see it and why they see it differently. And in your teaching, also, you can place the works and its reception and talking about it in a global perspective, in a sense, by not making it Indian or Pakistani or Islamic or Hindu or whatever you want to call it, but by pointing out that there are different ways of reading the text, and then you can bring those examples in. I know that there are always constraints. I always feel like doing that when I give lectures in Pakistan and people give me these historical cliches, right? Which they believe to be like absolutely true. And you feel the urge to say, look, this is one point of view. You learned it in school, okay? But if you go slightly beyond it, there is another point of view too, which is also recorded in history. The idea is you have to work within your constraints, right? So and then within that, you see how to dismantle the received hierarchies of knowledge. If you can do it by bringing stuff from elsewhere, do that. If you can do it openly, that's fine. If you can do it in a subtle way. The only thing that we should never do in a literature classroom is to tell the students, this is the only way of reading the text, because then we are not encouraging creativity. We are just encouraging that they should parrot the ideas of the professor and then get a good grade and get out. Okay, Hina, what are the most effective? Well, in humanities, I mean, I can't go into like specific techniques, but something that works for me is if I am teaching a deeply political text, which I do so many times because, I do post-colonial studies, I've noticed that I have problem when I bring in my own political ideas in the discussion. I mean, I am in Texas. But if we let the text speak for itself, right? Instead of saying, this is what I think, if you go and say, well, look, what is this character saying? What do you think about it? Then there is a layer between your opinion, and what the text says. So I would say always use the text as this safety precaution, because most of the times the students will get offended if it's your politics, right? They're already in a post-colonial studies class. It is a political class. They already know it. You don't even have to say anything political for them to know it. And your texts are already radical. So one thing that I found most effective, if you want to approach a body of students who will otherwise be hostile to you or hostile to your ideas, they at least walked into your class voluntarily and you have certain texts that you're teaching. Let's say you want to teach a bunch of men about feminism and about rights of women and equality of women. In Pakistan and elsewhere, it's easy for men. I mean, they just pull out the religious card and right. But you just let the text speak for itself. And if someone brings up religion, you tell them, sorry, I can't discuss religion in this class because it causes problems. It becomes disruptive. And this is a class in English literature. I'll be happy to hear your arguments, from a non-religious secular perspective, because that's what this text is. I don't know if you can say that or not. I think secularism is also a terrible thing to say. Okay, yeah, this is teachers in Pakistan and India have to teach grammar. Yeah, of course, I went through the same system. We used to have a paper A, I think, which used to be about the poems and literature, and paper B used to be about grammar. I don't know if you have to do it at college level too. But there are you could teach it grammar in context, right? Comprehension. But the problem is, in most of the cases, they also give you a textbook. And I have never really taught grammar, so I don't think so I'm qualified to answer that question. But if you ever come up with any interesting techniques of teaching grammar, which becomes interesting, I would love to hear that. In my case, in my 7th or 8th grade, we had a wonderful teacher who taught us English grammar. But the thing is, he made it fun and exciting because he will use local examples and he will put the sentences in there and say, okay, tell me, how do you tell this is passive voice? And then he would draw, if the file fail or maful agar ye yahan pe hai, so this is passive active. But he really made it very interesting for us. But if I think back and ask myself how he did that, I still won't be able to recall how he did that. Okay, Chandra. Integrating multiplicity of ideas in teaching may compromise their sharpness and clarity. Don't we need to attach values to the... Well, yes and no. I mean, the idea is, the premise that I am working with is that in humanities, there are no simple answers. And as you read more, you realize that concepts lose their sharpness, right? The only way we make something unique or make it stand out is, by extracting it from other things, right? By bracketing it, right? So I think if you tell the students, this is what generally is meant when I say the word sign, right? Signifier and signified. And then you realize it gets complicated and complicated. So they will always know the core concept, where did it come from, who theorized it, what does it mean. But then there is no harm in teaching them the ambiguities in it too. And how does it become more complicated? Now, if we take it upon ourselves to think that we are supposed to give our students crystal clear ideas about things and concepts, maybe then we'll feel like we are failing them. But I see my mission in terms of a humanities professor is to enable my students to think for themselves and to always think critically. And for that, if I give them more points of view, more ways of looking at the same concept or same practice, I feel like that's a better job because that enables them to think critically. Because at the end of the day, whenever we decide what something means for us, especially conceptually in humanities, is an outcome of what we have read, what was taught to us, what we have thought about it, right? And our own self is written in that decision. Now, if the larger that self becomes, the more adaptable would it be to deal with differences. That's roughly my idea about that. Okay, let's see if there are any other questions. Okay, so also keep in mind that I already have quite a few lectures on pedagogy of the oppressed and on critical pedagogy. And they are in their own playlists on the channel. You can always watch them. Now, Homera, and a webinar at well, we already did two. I did one a few months ago. There is another recorded one on the channel. And the reason I was moving into these other territories was because I didn't want to keep repeating it. But maybe down the road, we will do a more focused post-colonialism one, maybe pick up a text or two and then see how those texts theorize and talk about post-colonialism. But if you need a short description of post-colonialism, that's on my channel. But also a longer webinar of 1 hour recorded is also on there. And then, of course, there are like whole lists of post-colonial studies there. So you can absolutely see those as well. Okay. What else? I hope you all are staying safe and handling this pandemic as carefully as you can. In our case, my wife and I, we are teaching online, and I've been doing just this for my students. Every Tuesday, Thursday, I get in front of a computer, they come in, and we have a conversation about our classes, and this is how they ask these questions, just like this webinar. Okay. So let's go back to this question by Fayaz. The candidates are preparing for, they are looking for a book consisting of MCQs. Okay, I got you. The people who apply for lectureships, they have to take a centralized exam, and then they want a book that contains all possible multiple choice questions. It's kind of like preparing for GRE, I think. When you take your GRE, especially the verbal part, you just go through all these books which list all the possible questions about literature. So maybe that would be a good guide to prepare for these tests. Okay. Let's see. So let's go. I want to go back to Chandra's question because I think that's a really interesting. Another thing to keep in mind is that let's introduce the most stable definition or description of a term first so that they have something to hold on to, right, in teaching. And then expand from there. I agree that if we just throw different ways of looking at the same thing at them, it will confuse the students. But give them one or two plausible definitions first, but not as this is the ultimate answer, but as possibilities. And then when they have latched onto them, then you open them up a little bit and say, well, so-and-so says this could be this as well, and then so-and-so. That way they are working with what was supposed to be a stable definition, and then they, right in front of their eyes, that stability is destabilized and becomes different. So I think that would be really good. Okay, so I'm trying to see if there are any other questions or comments. Sometimes there is a delay in the comments, so I'm not seeing them. So no, I'm not seeing any new questions. So I guess. So let me see. I mean, we've been going for about 40 minutes and there are not a lot of people here, so I'll probably conclude soon. But let me remind you what is already available, on the website as well, postcolonial.net, but also on the channel. There is a whole series on Paulo Freire's Pedagogy of the Oppressed. We have already covered the first two chapters, so I do strongly urge you to watch it. There is one long webinar on radical pedagogy by Mark Proctor. But if you just go into the playlist about research and pedagogy, you will see there are quite a few shorter videos on different aspects of pedagogy. But as always, if you feel like there is something else I can cover, do let me know. Let me go to Fayaz. How can we make our subject interesting and arouse curiosity of the students as we teach grammar? That's a really that question is kind of stumping me. I would say, like, now my wife had to teach grammar classes once or twice for her students. And what she did was, instead of saying, here is past tense, she picked up a few passages from different books, right? And then she built assignments, and interesting passages too. She did assignments about noun, verbs, adjectives, adverbs, but those were within the context of the reading material, that just brief passages. So what she did was, she did one where she just asked them to, okay, find out, underline what are the nouns, right? And then explained how they fit in the word order, conjunctions, interjections. So one way would be where you give them definitions. Okay, here are the 6 parts of speech. A conjunction does this, right? An interjection does this, right? Which is the normal method that we use. The other could be that while you're teaching them the concepts, grammatical, first the basic concepts, do teach that in context. But since I'm not really a grammarian, I couldn't give you like how they do it, right? But for me, intuitively, I think that would work better. And then as you progress into more complex practices, right, develop your passages that you use or the examples that you use. I think that would work better. Okay. Dr. Raja, hi Shazia. I expect totally, they are from rural area and I don't know anything about them. What should I do to make them feel at home? Good, that's a really good question. Now, first of all, find out which part of Pakistan are they from. I think the biggest thing what they will find intimidating is you have to first figure out, are they absolutely okay? What is the digital divide? Do they have the resources to be online? And if they don't, how can you help them with that? Two, what I have found really useful is for rural students is that just let them know they're equally as good as anyone else. The only difference is that they're not privileged enough to go to like good schools and all, but that they can do really well. And Shazia, if they are from your region, if they are from Mansehra or Hazara, ਤੇ ਫਿਰ ਤੁਸੀਂ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਜਿਹੜਾ ਆਪਣੀ ਬੋਲੀ ਚ ਵੀ ਥੋੜੀ ਬਹੁਤੀ ਗੱਲ ਸੁਣਾਓ. You speak to them in their own language, not talk down, but let them, you are equally as human as they are, and that you respect that they are in a college classroom despite the disadvantage of living in a remote area. So I think you'll have to do more than just say, here is the content, study it. No, you will have to deal with them with more care and more love, right? And more encouragement. But most importantly, reassuring them every single time that you will be there for them, right? For additional help. And I think that would go tremendously well for you, for your classes. But other than that, content is the same. It's like you teach it in Karachi or Hyderabad. cover Shakespeare's plays with reference to post-colonial. Yeah, I will try to do that. I've been planning it. Don't have time for it yet, but yes, that's on my mind, and probably a few, especially The Tempest, and Othello and others. So Shazia, if they are from Okada, so they're not really rural. They are from Punjab, central Punjab. Yeah, they're probably from Okada, Kent. So yeah, then speak to them in Punjabi and ask them which village, which chak they're from. Just let them know that you're not from, this mountain far, far away, that you come from the same culture and that you will be there to help them. But most importantly, whichever university you're teaching from, ask the university, have you made sure that these students have access to internet, or are you just assuming that they have to come up with the internet? What is the university doing to make sure that these students are not left behind because of the digital divide, because they live in a small village, right? This is really the heartless commodification of education happening in South Asia, is that the students are left to fend for themselves. And we just expect them to have a smartphone and a computer and a stable internet connection without doing anything for it. So I would ask them first and foremost if they have access to technology, how convenient it is for them to be online, and how far away are they from the campus. If they are not too far away, maybe they can use a hotspot on campus, right? But these should be very important questions for them. For Pakistani literature in English, especially Tawfiq Rafat and Pakistani idiom on your list in the future. Yes, I'm actually planning a book on Pakistani literature in English, but I'm not going to record much about it in the near future, but eventually, yes. But Tawfiq Rafat is a Palestinian, I think, not Pakistani. But The Life of a Cockroach, right? Isn't that what he wrote? But yes, it will be eventually, but not in the near future. But I am planning a book on Pakistani writing in English in the next couple of years after I finish my current project. All right. All right, so Shazia, if you need any other resources, I don't know what you're teaching online, but feel free to use any of the videos on my channel or any materials from my website for your classes. And that's, of course, an option for all of you to do that. In a rare circumstances, if there is something that you absolutely need and that I have some form of expertise in it, let me know, and maybe I can record a brief lecture on it for you and post it online. Chandra, good. How the pedagogy of the oppressed benefits the oppressed? You'll have to read the book to find out. It's one of the most philosophical undertakings and one of the most effective ways of learning how to learn with the oppressed, not teach to them. But I would highly recommend read the book, because some of the practices that he talks about, he actually practiced. But the idea in the book isn't that someone goes and teaches the oppressed. No, you learn from them in solidarity with them. And then the purpose of the education isn't just to impart knowledge, it is to create a world in which we all can live, equally. But I would say read the book, and that would really help you figure out, what Freire is saying about education. All right, good. Yeah, I would love to do that, Shazia. You can invite me anytime. Just let me know, and we will set up, a live webinar or a Zoom meeting, something. Any one of you here, if you ever want me to do a lecture for your students, it will depend on my time constraints. But if you give me enough warning, I can always plan an online lecture for your students, especially in this pandemic. All right, so we are going to about, it's almost an hour, and I think we have pretty much exhausted all the questions. And so this is great. I'm so glad you joined me. So I will also post the link for the next week's webinar soon. If you have any ideas about future webinars, just let me know and I'll see if I can plan one on that. And also, thank you so much for joining me. This always is a very invigorating experience for me. And, personally, it's a very rewarding experience for me. And I thank you all for that and for your support. And also, an edited version of this will be available soon on my channel, so you can always go back and watch it again. So that's all I have. I don't see any more questions. But thank you so much for joining me, and I will now see you next week, I hope. And until then, stay safe, take care of yourself, take care of each other, stay positive, and I will sign off with my usual slogan, which is peace and love. Khuda Hafiz. Goodbye.